Welcome to the Majlis. I'm your host, Adnan Husain, Director of the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project here at Queen's University. And we're here to talk about a very important topic, current events in the Islamic world. As many of you will be aware, August 31st is the deadline set by the Biden administration for the withdrawal of U.S. military personnel. And evacuation of NATO troops and diplomatic corps has also accelerated in light of the collapse of the previous Afghan government led by President Ashraf Ghani, who has fled the country before the stunningly quick advance of Taliban forces in the last weeks. In a very unstable situation, just hours ago at Kabul airport, at time of recording, at Kabul airport, 2 bombs killed 72 people. And Islamic State has claimed responsibility, the Khorasan Brigade of the Islamic State. To talk about the history of Afghanistan, to put it into some context, to reflect on 20 years of US and NATO's war and occupation of the country, current events, and the future of Afghanistan, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Ariel Salzmann, who teaches modern, Middle Eastern, and world history at Queen's University. Hi, Ariel. Thanks for returning to
Hello,
the
Adnan.
Majlis.
How are you? Yeah.
It's good to have you back to the Majlis to discuss this concerning situation in Afghanistan and unfolding events. Um, as I just mentioned, there was this huge set of attacks at the Kabul airport that killed 72 people. Um, I remember you giving a presentation 6 years ago in 2014 after Canada ended its military and training involvement. It was just announced a few hours before the bomb attacks that Canada's evacuation mission of its diplomatic personnel and others has ended as well. But in 2014, you gave a talk, a public talk about the failure of the US and NATO war in Afghanistan. It's evidently been a failure for a very long time, but it's been going on and dragging on for years after it was obvious. What are your reflections now, looking at 20 years of the war in Afghanistan?
First of all, I don't think we can talk about 20 years. The U.S. has been involved there since basically the end of the Cold War. They got involved after there was a coup that brought to power Soviet-backed governments, a succession of them, 2 parties, and the U.S. then promptly plunged in with their Saudi and Pakistani allies into an insurgency and funding basically what are now the great-grandfathers of the Taliban, the Mujahideen. So they funded this war. It was funded through Pakistan, and it went on for a decade, basically being one of the chief causes of the collapse of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They bled the Soviet Union, and the politicians in the United States said, basically, Afghanistan is the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and we're going to cause, the same damage. And indeed, the Soviets lost lots and lots of people, and the Afghan countryside was seamed with mines, some of the worst conditions beyond some place like Cambodia or West Africa, and then again, as now, the U.S. cut and ran, leaving the Afghans to be plunged into civil war and statelessness until the Taliban came to power, in the late 1990s, and gradually took over the country.
That's right. I mean, they didn't end up taking over the entire country, but the
No.
majority of it. And in many cases, after years of devastating war and then civil war, as you point out, there were some quarters that actually welcomed them as imposing a kind of harsh justice, but at least keeping the peace in parts of the country. Um,
Yeah, there's
so
wide-scale looting, rapine, assaults on people. Millions of Afghans have been refugees all over the world, but especially in Pakistan and Iran. And so, we let we, meaning I'm still a US citizen, and the world basically abandoned Afghanistan after funding this war of attrition against the Soviet Union and destroying the country and leaving the population bereft of support, a government, or anything else. And this continuing, ongoing, and as you said, period of chaos, which put everyone's lives at risk. And in many cases, Afghan friends of mine and one colleague who did a lot of studies of Afghan women in the refugee camps in Pakistan was telling me that the Mujahideen period, the warlord period, was actually much worse than either what would come after the Taliban takeover or the Soviet period. There was so much fighting, and no one was safe, and just horrible atrocities were committed against ethnic groups, and unfortunately, the Taliban continued some of those. But against assaults on women and boys were widespread. So this war in Afghanistan is not a 20-year war.
It's a 40-year war.
It's a 40-year war.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, some people have been astonished at the speed of the Taliban's takeover. I mean, I think it's clear that the U.S., when it made these announcements of withdrawal of U.S. troops, expected the former Afghan government to persist at least for some months. And so there were a lot of plans in place for continued U.S. presence, if not through its direct military, through contractors and advisors and other sorts of personnel. But the speed of the collapse of the government and the turning, the either disappearance or turning to the other side and joining the Taliban of the National Army and so on, seems to have taken all the planners in the US and NATO very much by surprise. And they're left in this situation where they're having to make these hasty evacuations. In some ways, some people might suggest that that has prevented a interminable or at least very devastating repeat of the period of the warlords in the period after the U.S. withdrawal the first time. And that, at least in this circumstance, a major civil war has been avoided. I don't know what you think about that and the consequences of the collapse of the government this way.
Well, again, 6 years ago, basically, I pointed out that according to just tourist references, where not to travel in Afghanistan, put on, the British websites and the American, that 2/3 of the province were in some state of contestation between Afghan forces and the Taliban, and were off limits. And within a few years, that had gone as high as 90% of Afghanistan was off limits, and it was not recommended that you travel anywhere except basically around Kabul and a few other cities. So the fact that Afghanistan would and the existing army would collapse like a house of cards, with this rapidity, shouldn't have surprised anyone. The Afghan government, especially Ashraf Ghani, the more we're learning about his final days in office and actually knowing him personally and the kind of person he is, one could imagine him living in a complete bubble. I mean, he did warn Biden that things were dire, and that he shouldn't pull out the troops, he shouldn't make these announcements. Apparently, he asked Biden not to give out so many visas, that it was basically like a run on the bank. And so everybody got the message that Afghanistan, that all the forces, the last retaining walls against the Taliban were falling, and everybody, started running. But the fact was, this has been going on for such a long time, and Kabul was a complete bubble, with shopping malls and really elite, often very corrupt Afghan upper class living in Kabul, people who got salaries with NGOs, the high hardship salaries, living there in gated compounds, etc., and just completely cut off from the rest of the country, or from what the average Afghan was living. I mean, the average Afghan was living with this, damned if I do and damned if I don't. I mean, it's both, bombing from the air, thousands, tens of thousands of casualties caused supposedly to save them from the Taliban, and attacks by the Taliban. And this had been going on for 20 years, this phase. Some of these people have been refugees. And, by all accounts, the anthropological studies that came out in the 2010s, conversations with friends of mine, there was such a level of cynicism. It was impossible to think that the army had any popular support. They were being propped up. And as soon as it was clear that there was no future, they they gave up. There's another explanation too that Netta Crawford, who's been one of the major intellectual, moral support of the Costs of War project at Brown University, she wrote an op-ed piece recently, and she said she feels that the Afghan army gave up to prevent civil war.
Right.
That they turned over their arms and say, this is going to go on endlessly, and it's time to put down our arms. But I think it's a combination of all things. People knew there would be retaliation. People knew that there was no longer any support for them. They were demoralized. They were demoralized by the political situation, with this ongoing corruption, this pretense of democracy, beginning, with Karzai, some hope, bringing together notables, the Loya Jirga and all that. But by the time Ghani ran, that election was contested, his second election was contested.
That's
and
right.
the pretense of there actually being some sort of functioning representative government was clearly becoming a facade, a charade that the US was propping up in order to justify why they were there.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good point about the weakness of the government and how out of touch it was, so that it shouldn't be much of a surprise. I remember hearing very recently one Afghan academic based in Kabul said that he heard from truckers, who transported goods and, other things, both legally and illegally, but, the people who connected the country in some ways
Yeah, yeah.
through trucking, um, said that the real difference for them between the Afghan government and the Taliban was that the Taliban gave you a receipt. Like you paid once your like tolls and your duties, whereas every single stop and provincial governor and so
Yeah,
on in the
I had a
current
handout.
system had to, take their levy, and you never could count on, any kind of a fair process, which isn't to say that they wanted the Taliban back, but that was their observation, that the government was so corrupt. Um, that it was just a sort of fiction of a functioning state, really.
The other thing, that the irony, and I said that, I gave that talk actually at Queens and also in Paris at a conference that was being held. And the irony is this too: the American NATO-led, US-led NATO operations, with some variations here and there, depending on, national governments, Turkey or maybe Canada to some extent, more emphasis on quote unquote humanitarian aid. The fact is, they never learned. They never learned anything. They never learned anything about the country. They never learned anything about the people. They never revised their strategy. Surge does not mean a revision of your game plan. It just means a bigger buildup, doing more of the same wrong things over and over again. Meanwhile, there's been a couple generations of Mujahideen slash Taliban, and they've learned. They've learned when they're not wanted. That they've learned that if they go too far in one direction and if they're too punitive, they're going to lose the support of the people. They've learned a checks and balance system. They actually had these satellite phones in villages where they'd go into a village and they'd appoint, they'd say, okay, who's the guy you really respect? Of course, it was a man.
Mm-hmm.
But who is the person you respect? They put him in charge of the village. They gave him responsibilities and whatever funding, and there would be a Taliban commander who would make the rounds. But the person who was in charge of that village would also have a satellite phone. And if the Taliban commander, the military wing, got out of hand, he would call back to Pakistan, to headquarters, and tell them and report these people. So there's a beginning of a checks and balance system. And the greatest irony here is that Ashraf Ghani,
Hmm.
who was an academic, but then World Bank person, and then in the first post-Taliban government with Karzai, actually wrote a book about and did all these TED Talks on how to rescue failed states by rebuilding accountability from the base up. Who did
Well,
that? The
yeah,
Taliban did that.
right.
I mean, obviously, in their own limited way of seeing, right and wrong and justice in a very black and white way, but nonetheless, employing some high tech fashion functions like satellite phones and stuff to create some checks and balances so that their commanders, many of whom have no experience in governing,
Hmm.
and have very little education or very rudimentary education and knowledge about the world, would have checks by people further up who had more sophistication, more knowledge, and a view of the whole. Uh, Now, the problem here is, I mean, I think on that level, they've succeeded in at least convincing many Afghans under their control that they are the lesser of evils.
Right. That they're
As
a
you
little bit
say,
less
they're
corrupt.
the less
They may be
corrupt,
harsh,
more
but they
yeah,
will be
accountability,
responsive. Yes.
yeah, predictability.
Some kind of form of justice of administering,
Exactly.
dispute resolution and so on.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
right. And even when they were in power, I mean, to think that they were, you know, anti-human or didn't care about the welfare of the people was completely wrong, because one of the programs that they really worked very hard at was the demining program. And
Mhm.
the UN and other international organizations who worked with them said they were very sincere. They knew this is an agricultural country. These are people from these villages. They know to get this country back on its feet, you have to get people back on the land. And if the whole country's just seamed with mines, then you can't do that. And so they were very willing to work opium eradication.
Mhm.
The Muslims, they don't believe in smoking opium. They will do it they'll use it to fund an emergency, but in general, they were against the opium and were trying to suppress it.
That's right. In the
And
late
demining,
1990s, there
yeah,
were UN reports
yeah,
that suggested that they had done
yes,
quite a lot
yes.
of
They
poppy production eradication.
That's right.
Yes,
That's
that's
right.
right.
That's
Yeah.
right. So there's ways, and the people who worked with that group of Taliban. Okay, we're already, we're talking 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Said it was like it was pulling teeth. It was very difficult,
Hmm.
but it was possible. That you're dealing with people who had been raised in refugee camps. Whose only formal education was sort of rote in a madrasa
Madrasa.
school, and just Quran memorization, had no knowledge of the world, had very little experience. And I think this is, of that generation too. Families, they've been cut off from their families,
Hmm.
very, you know, no contact with women.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of sociological things that had to do with the trauma of the 1980s. And if you're talking about, I mean, this is just struck me is so absurd. We talk. I mean, it's true. We have now a generation, tens of thousands of soldiers all over the world, but particularly the United States, hundreds of thousands who have post traumatic stress from being, in the Afghan theater, maybe, you know, four times. I mean, it's extraordinarily high given vis-a-vis what happened in Vietnam. People would serve one, maximum two tours of duty in Vietnam, and in the 2000s, we're talking about people who've served several times in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we were talking about this generation of PTSD. Think about the PTSD of generations of Afghans living in this continuous war, 40
Yeah.
years, and deprivation and displacement. So it's really it's one of the most tragic situations I can think of, really.
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent and important point. One of the things that you're pointing out, though, I think, is also that you know, over the course of 20, 25 years, obviously the Taliban, what we call the Taliban, this movement, has changed. I mean, there are two, at least one or maybe two generations of fighters. I mean, Afghanistan's population is incredibly young, so
Yeah,
most of
yeah,
the people, were raised in the era of the US and NATO war and occupation. They don't remember Afghanistan before. They weren't part of the Taliban originally, those policies, and all they have grown up and known is these Western countries that are bombarding, and they're resisting that. And so they may have a very different perspective and approach. It's hard to know exactly whether there will be more flexibility on some of these, whether they've learned that if you want to have some kind of formal relations and continuance of aid while getting rid of the military occupation and military troops, to have some diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, you know, will they refrain from, for example, persecuting and massacring the Hazara, for example, if they want to cultivate either both peace and maybe relations with positive relations with Iran, for example, or how will they conduct themselves? It'll be interesting to see, because it's not the same Taliban as the era of Mullah Omar, in the late 90s. And so that raises a kind of a question for me that maybe you might have some thoughts on here, which is how will they govern at this point? And we already see, for example, negotiations with China, and there have been apparently agreements very quickly, for mineral, exploitation, and so the question is, what kinds of relations will they have with outside powers, and what are going to be some of the regional consequences of the Taliban takeover in terms of the future of Afghanistan?
yeah. No, I mean, China is interesting. There's a little tiny tip of Afghanistan with borders on
Yeah,
China.
that's right.
Um, Pakistan has already made it clear that they will not take a stand on China's what we now know to be a genocidal policy against the Uyghur Muslims.
Hmm.
And so Pakistan has, shut its mouth, see no evil, because they have a lot of um, commercial, strategic, and all sorts of ties with China, and they don't want to disrupt them. And I would think that the Taliban, who, have had their base in Pakistan for a long time, are taking some of their cues here.
Hmm.
But the problem with that is going to be very interesting, because you've had a flow of internationalists in Afghanistan who worked, before the coming to power of the Taliban with the Mujahideen, that included Osama bin Laden.
Right.
And you've had Chinese Muslims who
Yes.
migrated there, and Chechens and Turks and
Exactly.
North Africans and Egyptians and everybody else. So there's the internationalist, pan-Islamic, if you will,
Hmm.
banner that's there. So it's going to be interesting to see how much uh, and there is a crossover in the Taliban. There's a Pakistani Taliban, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how much the Afghan Taliban can disengage
Hmm.
with the ISI, the
Right.
Pakistani Secret Service,
Yes.
and their sort of directives. In order to, on the one side, that's what China wants. It wants that access to minerals, which Afghanistan is filled with.
Lithium,
There's
I think.
oil. Well, there's the possibility of Central Asian pipeline that was
Hmm.
scuttled
Hmm.
because of all the conflict that would have come from, I guess, Turkmenistan. I'm not sure, but anyways, would have
Right. The
crossed through
Unocal
Afghanistan.
project in the mid
Yeah,
90s that was
yeah,
being
in the
used.
90s.
That's right.
So there's all sorts of things that China wants, but the one thing it doesn't want
Yeah.
is a
Internationalists. That's right.
internationalist movement where its
Of
own population denigrated.
Xinjiang,
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
expats,
So there's
refugees
going
who
to
are
be
part of
this
that.
balance there, and that, unfortunately, it's a very cynical
Hmm.
balance that I think is probably weighed into the sort of calculus of the Biden administration.
Absolutely. I was just
That
going
it,
to
yeah,
ask, what do you
and that
think
for
is their
China,
role?
either it's a win-lose situation,
Right.
but it's not going to be any skin off the US, because China's going to have to manage it in the sort of way of a sort of North Korean sort of model.
Hmm.
Um, but that there is that danger, and Pakistan definitely. I mean, I think the unknowns here are India and Iran,
Right.
because for
But
Pakistan,
before we go
yeah,
to
sorry,
India and Iran, I just wanted to follow up and ask a little bit about how the Islamic State Khorasan Brigade
yeah,
attack, what does that portend in terms of a possible rift between, the Taliban, who for all their conservative religious conservatism are not really radicals and internationalists, at least in their history and in their rhetoric. They've been emphasizing very much this kind of Afghan resistance to foreign occupation and so on. Whether there will be tensions, I mean, it doesn't seem to me that the bombardment, and the killing of 72 people in the airport is anything that the Taliban, in their current situation, or at least certain factions, sort of mainstream factions, if you want, of those who were militarily successful in taking back almost all of the country, would have been interested in. This is not good, I think, for their interest of having these Western countries evacuate as quickly as possible and adhering to the August 31st deadline, which sort of suggests that there have been tensions possibly between these internationalist jihadist sort of groups and forces and at least some major elements of the Taliban.
I think the real problem here is that what I've said about the Taliban is they sort of, to my mind, what they were able to accomplish was what the US never was able to accomplish, was get at the ground level, at the
Yeah,
micro level, right?
right.
I am very skeptical about them actually being able to govern the entire country.
Yes, yeah.
They lack that kind of technocratic, bureaucratic expertise.
Well,
And
and the
that
fleeing of all these people
kind of
who,
thing, there's a brain drain,
the brain drain with all the visas. Yeah,
brain drain.
that's right.
And and whether they would have engaged these people to begin with. So I think the inherent danger is that they're not able to govern. I mean, they're
Yes,
not able to rule. I make this
right.
distinction. They're able to govern at the local level,
Yeah,
to create little mini governments, mini models at village level, maybe some sort of organization at province by province, but they don't. I don't see them having a structure. I mean, the structure then would have been something, like out of Pakistan, multi-party
right.
system, right?
Yeah.
But you don't see
Well,
them
no,
having
you
that.
don't see that, and you also didn't see
Yeah,
them in their takeover announcing, for example, once the Ashraf Ghani departs. I mean, they could have said, okay, you lower functionaries and bureaucrats and people who
yeah,
are
stay in
administrative,
place.
stay in place. We will be announcing plans, and we intend to govern for all Afghans, but just continue, picking up the garbage and doing those sorts of things and administering. They didn't do that. So they haven't exactly formally dissolved those things, but they also haven't really
No, and they don't
given
have a
them the go
formal,
ahead to continue, and they don't
they don't
have
have a
the.
formal military structure
That's
either.
right. Yeah, yeah,
So there's no sort of real, defined, evolved hierarchical structure in any of the Taliban things. I mean, they've sort of relied, and it would be interesting to see on the ISI to sort of
yes,
schedule these things.
right.
But they don't have, as far as I can see, any kind of structure that would translate
Yeah,
into a state.
to an
So
administrative
that,
state. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
administrative, bureaucratic,
right. Yeah.
national,
I mean, it's not even
hierarchical
completely
state.
clear that the Qatari-based political and diplomatic leadership that has had contacts with other countries and makes these formal statements is necessarily, capable of directing and controlling on the ground commanders. Just to point out that there is no formal structure that seems to really guide policy or statements politically by that group and local commanders on the ground. Yeah,
Yeah, and then talking about demobilizing.
right.
How are these, fighters going to be sort of either incorporated in the new government? How are they going to get paid? How are they going to be resettled?
Oh,
How
well,
are they
Paul
going to
Bremer
be?
has a great idea. Just tell them to all go home. You're no longer employed,
They're
right?
Well, no, but the Taliban also, I believe, promised to sort of disarm,
Yes.
people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, they're going to have this tension within their own organization
Hmm.
that bodes poorly.
Hmm.
And then they have competitors, and they've had them. And I thought that one of the reasons they were ending up at the negotiations was because of these groups. That unless they could prove some real gains, the people and young people who are disillusioned,
Right.
we're going to go over to other sides, and those other sides are probably better funded in some way. I mean, they've all got these funding streams that
Hmm.
we still don't
Murky.
understand
That's right.
completely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so
You're saying
that,
like some of these like more internationalist
yeah,
jihadist
the
groups.
IIS,
That's
yeah,
right.
the
The
Islamic
Khorasan
Brigade,
brigades or whatever.
Khorasan Brigade,
Yeah.
they're winning converts. So, I mean, I think that was one of the things pushing them in the direction. The problem is, again, who, another, if you think Ashraf Ghani, was, you know, foolish and, just in some kind of bubble or egotistical. I mean, he's a very shrill, person who doesn't suffer fools and doesn't work well with people. I mean, that was known about him to begin with, and I think his
Not
last
a
cabinet.
natural politician.
Exactly, and he lived most of his life outside in New York
Yeah.
and went to school in Beirut, etc. But Zalman Khalizad, I
Yeah.
mean, this guy's completely clueless. I
Mm.
mean, he was the one saying, all these things. I mean, just like in May, oh, the government won't fall. Oh, it'll take months. It's just mind boggling how detached that generation of Afghans are from what's going on the ground. I mean, they're even more so because, like Ashraf Ghani, Salmai Khalilzad, they've all found their niche in these international, in their new homes in the United States, etc.
Right.
And they're in more ways, their head is more in the clouds in some cases than, of course, many of the military people in the U.S. They were talking, they were interviewing this Seth Moulton. He's a former Marine who served in Iraq. He's a representative from Massachusetts now.
Mm.
And Seth Moulton was just screaming at the top of his lungs that, Kabul's going to fall, Kabul, the Chicken Little, and no one in the Biden administration will listen to him. He's been saying it for weeks,
Hmm.
So
Well, I
people,
think July, when in July the Taliban made a successful advance into those northern provinces that essentially encircled Kabul,
yeah,
was not in the south in the Patan heartlands, but up, on the border provinces to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan that really cut off supply lines and access for, the Kabul government. I think the writing was on the wall, and that at least was a month or so before that sudden advance where they captured a lot of cities. So, I think that should have been a very obvious telltale sign that the troops just went over the border to Tajikistan or joined the Taliban. So um, obviously there were a lot of blinkered perspectives on this, and there was no preparation, and so now we have this situation that's quite chaotic here, then rather unstable, and it's going to be very interesting what the future direction now is. You were about to mention Pakistan and Iran when we were doing our sense of the regional
yeah.
consequences of the Taliban takeover. What do you think?
Well,
Why do you
Pakistan,
think they're the keys?
friends of mine who are in Pakistan actually right now, even among intellectuals, there's a sort of, um, I wouldn't say glee, but sort of, that the U.S. has finally been chased out, and
Right.
there's sort of a nationalist, well, we did it,
Yeah.
behind the scenes with the Taliban, which made other Pakistanis I know very uncomfortable. But the fact is that Pakistan has never thought of Afghanistan as a separate place.
Right.
The border has never been defined. The colonial border has always
The
remained
Grand
amorphous.
Line was never
Yeah,
accepted.
Quran
That's right.
was never accepted.
No.
Like Kashmir, it is this strategic, no person's land.
Hmm.
And so Afghanistan's importance to Pakistan and India has increased since, of course, the 1990s when both became officially nuclear powers.
Right.
And so for Pakistan, the idea is that it's a very narrow geographic country. If there's ever a nuclear attack, there's nowhere for the Pakistani administration to run except Afghanistan. That it's part of this notion of strategic depth. So there's never going to be, as far as Pakistan, a line there. And then, of course, you've got peoples and ethnic groups that straddle both sides of the line, and that would be a problem in and of itself because they would be forced to choose, which side they're on. So there's ways in which Pakistan will remain, one of the dominant forces in whatever happens in Afghanistan, and whether the Taliban will be able to put together a government at all. They might end up, having a lot of, visiting visiting officials, and help in doing it. The problem is North China, um, Tajikistan, other Central Asian countries are there too,
Hmm.
not great shape either, and Iran. And Iran is going to be, I think, the wild card in all of this. I mean, they still have long-standing with Shiite populations, of course, in Khorasan, in
Right.
Herat, in that region.
The Hazara. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Around
they had a
Mazar.
long time with the Panjshir government. Ahmed Shah Massoud is now his son, who's in the
Yeah.
air and who's supposedly negotiating. The Taliban haven't made an assault on Panjshir. They're negotiating with him, and I sort of suspect that the Taliban do want some kind of relationship with Iran. But I think that's the opportunity for if the United States would finally want to consolidate its, rapprochement with Iran over the nuclear deal. That was another way they could, find some common ground and maybe return to the bargaining table and discussions and diplomacy. One of the things I just have to backtrack here. In 2001, one of the great tragedies was, of course, the U.S. had already blown the post-Cold War, many
Right.
times over. But there was another opportunity in 2001.
Hmm.
Almost the entire world was willing. The Iranians offered help, the Russians offered help. Everyone was on board.
Well, even
You
the
know,
Taliban were willing to negotiate the
yeah,
handover of
yeah,
Osama bin
yeah.
Laden.
And everything was there, but also to rebuild Afghanistan
Yeah.
and to have this international cooperation. And there was great sympathy for the United States. At that moment, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon less so, I'm sure. But anyway, the loss of life, um, and and of course the Bush administration completely spit in their faces and drag the world into this endless war and the destruction of now, not the rebuilding of Afghanistan, so the destruction of Iraq and the destruction of Syria, direct
Right.
result of
Right.
Iraq. And of course, no solution in Palestine.
Yeah.
And the list goes on, or Libya. So it's just been,
Well,
enormous,
it would have
history's
required.
been written. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it would have required the kind of self-reflection about the U.S.'s history of imperialism and involvement and responsibility for the Mujahideen, even becoming so powerful as to be part of the um, you know destruction of Afghanistan. Those responsibilities were, of course, never really acknowledged. It would have required framing the U.S.'s relationship to Afghanistan within some sense of reparation rather than
Yeah.
vengeance.
So
That's the problem.
yeah, it was vengeance, but it was also, as we know, extreme opportunism.
Yes,
That
yes,
you start, it was just like, oops, that happened.
right,
We should have known it. but oh, there's another prize that we'll go after. So the immediate diversion into Iraq, you know.
That's right.
But I think there's something else. I mean, I know there were the Russell tribunals on political on crimes,
Mm.
you know, attempts to talk about Iraq, etc. But there really has to be a discussion about what kind of crime against humanity these wars have been. Not just mistakes. We are always talking about
Yes,
mistake.
yes.
They're crimes against humanity. And in this particular time period, when, you know, in the post Cold War, when so much was and is at stake, not just in terms of the militarization of the world, you know, huge disparities in wealth and poverty, you know, between the rich and the poor, but also the climate crisis that we're in an existential state, that 20-year period that
Yeah.
we have lost, that
Yes.
the world has lost, that certain peoples, of course, have paid an incredibly high price for, is also might endanger the entire future of this planet because those resources that should have been spent, you know, in cooperation, in creating some sort of semblance of partnership for what's coming, were squandered. Were squandered, and worse than that, made everything much worse. Made things so intractable between the powers as well as between countries that had been the victims of these machinations and violence, you know, on a scale that's never been seen before, you know, size scale of bombings, you know, the amount of bombs that, you know, went off over Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, you know, the drone warfare. I mean, it just keeps escalating and
Hmm.
to a point where it's very hard to think of how we're going to de-escalate in order to really address the things that threaten everyone. So, but back to this whole thing. I mean, we don't have a vocabulary. I mean, again, I'm very admiring of this project at Brown University when they call it the costs of war, but it really should be the crimes of war.
Hmm.
You know, the crimes against specific groups, against specific peoples, but the crimes against uh, life as a whole, humanity as a whole. That these are new type of crimes against humanity, and they're being carried out with weapons and technologies that have not been in existence before this, which distance ourselves from them even more, like with the drone system. So,
Well, Ariel, I think that is a really profound way to sum up what the consequences of the last 20 years. You talked about it that it's been 40 years, so in some ways it's the consequences of the last 40 years, but the missed opportunities, the criminal waste that the global war on terrorism has caused for humanity globally is a way of really reflecting on this moment that goes well beyond the particular tragedies for the Afghan people who have suffered, as you pointed out, disproportionately and horrifically through the US and NATO wars there. But the consequences are truly global for humanity, and we are at this moment where looking back 20 years have been utterly wasted, and we have a huge challenge ahead. So I really want to thank you for those reflections and for your learned and erudite analysis of the Afghan situation. Thanks so much for discussing with us on the Much List.
thank you.